Welcome to the world of scale modeling with Mike Ashe, where techniques, tips, and creativity come alive with dozens of tutorials, projects, tape-up reviews, and picture references to help you build better scale models and enjoy our wonderful hobby. In episode 11, in building and detailing the Monogram Revell 148 scale B-25J, I've glued the tail on, and the most important part is sanding it smooth and getting it contoured into the fuselage.
Just to recap what I've done and bring everybody up to date, I have completed all of the seam work and smoothed it out with some fine grit sandpaper that I wet sanded onto the surface. And I found some more minor flaws here from super glue that had dripped, like in this area right here. The other thing I did, well, let me show you the top side. Same thing. I've got the tail glued on now, and I'll get to that in a second. But there are two kit parts that go here and here. So what I did was I scraped off some paint, and I'm going to put a little bit of masking tape over these two locations here. And the same thing here. There's a part that goes here, and there's a part that goes here. So again, I scraped off the paint, and I'll put a tiny bit of masking tape over this so that when I finish painting the model, I won't have to scrape it off. Now on the tail, which fits together onto the surface of the model fairly well, you've got a gap along here, and I have filled this with super glue, and I'm going to attempt to go ahead and fix this seam without destroying this surface detail. So unfortunately, the surface detail around this raised panel line area was marred, so I haven't decided what I'm going to do yet over here. I don't know if I'm going to just remove it or try to rescribe it. But if you review my video on panel lines and how they relate to actual aircraft, the B-25 was covered with lap joints and rivets. I've seen enough of them at museums. So in 148 scale, you're almost not going to see any surface detail at all other than possibly tiny rivets, which of course this kit doesn't have. So what I may do is just put a little bit of tape here and in other places and just remove the marred panel lines, the raised panel lines that go across the top here. And there's like 4 or 5 of them, and that'll preserve most of the panel line detail on the sides. And I may do the same thing on the bottom. The problem with rescribing it is the panel lines don't exactly match up, and so they're going to be at a slight angle. So I think the solution is, again, to remove it from here to here with some fine grit sanding sticks, which I'll wet sand here and other places. Now on the tail, I wanted to show you this. There's a slight variance in the thickness of these two sections here, but when you put the canopy on, which fits quite well on the tail, you're really not going to see that very much. So I'm not going to mess with trying to fix this difference in thickness, although if I can get in there and scrape it, I may take a crack at it, but it's not important. What is important is to flatten this out and flatten this out, and to fix this seam here, which means that this surface detail right here, which is looks like a reinforcer for the skeletal structure of the aircraft at the tail area, is we're going to lose this. I may be able to replace that with my Waldron punch kit, but we'll have to take a look at that.
As we begin the sanding and shaping and contouring process, note that I'm wet sanding and I'm using these very fine grit thin sanding sticks. I mask that raised surface detail on the top of the tail, and I carefully sand it around it. As I progress into the sanding and shaping process, I'm going to speed the video up to save some time. Be sure to light sand around the tail. What you don't want to do is to indent the surface of the fuselage, because once you paint it, you're going to see those indentations. So be very, very careful and light in your sanding. Here, I'm very carefully contouring the canopy framing that was part of the tail section to the canopy framing that was molded onto the fuselage. What you don't want to do here is make indentations or mar this detail. Through careful sanding and scraping, I was actually able to preserve the raised surface detail that are those half discs on the left and right sides of the aft section of the fuselage, so I didn't have to replace them with my Waldron punch tool. As I do with all of my seam work, here I'm adding a coat of silver paint so that I can check for any flaws and areas that I may have missed. And if I do find them, I'll just add some more super glue right over that silver paint and then sand it smooth. What I'm doing here is I'm adding a tiny bead of super glue along the seam line on the underside where the tail attaches to the fuselage. And if you're very careful how you do this, you can fill in that tiny seam and have to do very, very little sanding in order to get that glue to disappear. Once the second coat of super glue is dried, I'll go ahead and wet sand it smooth, check for flaws one more time, and we'll be good to go. Here are the things that I've accomplished so far on the fuselage. I went ahead and smoothed out all of the plastic along the seam lines, and then what I did was I taped along the edges of the raised panel lines, because I had mentioned in an earlier video, these panel lines which come across the seams are a little bit off from each other. So what I decided to do was just remove them. But I wanted to leave as much of the panel line detail on the sides of the fuselage. So where you can see the tape, and I use sanding sticks to carefully sand off all of the damaged raised seams. And I did the same thing on the top. I have finished contouring off the tail area, and it looks pretty good. And I was able to preserve this detail right here. So where I'm at is I am ready, and I'll talk about the nose piece in a minute, but some additional things that I did is I put a lot of weight in here. And in order to get the nose piece to fit together better, I went ahead and removed some of the plastic on this piece here, because it wasn't, the nose cone wasn't upside down, the nose cone wasn't sitting correctly on here. So that has been accomplished, and it fits pretty tight. So I did make some modifications to the nose cone. I'll talk about that in a minute. So to recap, I preserved as much as the raised panel line detail along the sides of the fuselage as possible, but carefully sanded off the panel lines that came across the top of the seam areas on both the upper surface and the lower surface. The other thing I did was I got a piece of balsa wood here with a fine grit sandpaper wrapped around it. And I was able to, with that edge, I was able to get in there like this and sand some of that super glue flat. So these are now ready for priming after the plastic has been polished, and then I'll go ahead and fill that with some white glue and then contour it with a wet Q-tip. So that's what I've accomplished thus far on the fuselage, and I'm actually close to being done and ready to attach the nose piece to it. So I'll go ahead and stop here, and then we'll talk about the nose piece. Thanks for watching episode 11. In episode 12, we'll attach the nose piece, and I'll go over in detail the modifications that I made to that nose piece for both weight and balance and getting it to attach to the fuselage correctly. So stay tuned. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a thumbs up. And when you get the chance, visit our website at www.mikeashley.com, where you're going to find dozens of free PDF downloads, including tutorials, picture references, model galleries, projects, and my 5 original scale modeling books. Thanks to Ben Sound and Videvo for the royalty-free music, and happy scale modeling!